On Monday, President Joe Biden visited parts of flood ravaged Kentucky, where dozens of people have been killed in rising waters over the last few weeks. Biden's press secretary, Karine Jean Pierre, said the disaster was a reminder of the intensifying and accelerating impacts of climate change. And she pointed to the Senate's passage of the Inflation Reduction Act as vital to saving lives and protecting communities like those hit in Kentucky. Whether that's actually true or not, well, that remains to be seen. The upper chamber did pass the legislation after a marathon of votes over the weekend. The House is expected to take up the measure later this week. Even though it's called the Inflation Reduction Act and won't actually do anything to reduce inflation, the bill is intended to make investments to fight off global warming. The thrust of it is over $300 billion in direct investments and tax credits for companies and consumers to purchase clean energy technology, be it for industrial production or home appliances and electric cars. The premise of the legislation is that the market can solve climate change, that by stimulating the demand side of clean energy through lowering prices of things like batteries and solar panels and electric vehicles, consumers will just naturally shift away from fossil fuels. An analysis by the Rhodium Group, which has been touted by the bill's supporters, claims the Inflation Reduction Act could curb CO2 emissions by upwards of 44% from peak 2005 levels. Now, that would still be well below carbon reductions that the U.S. agreed to as part of the Paris Climate Accords, requires emissions to drop by over 50% by 2030. Also, looking at the analysis, the range of outcomes from the bill are pretty wide. 44% decline in emissions is at the upper end of the estimate. The lower end of the estimate finds the legislation may not achieve any more CO2 reduction than the current status quo. That's because it all depends on how consumers will react to the bill, and if it will indeed trigger a transformation. Already, there are worrying signs that it might not. For example, the legislation adds new restrictions to the $7,500 tax rebate consumers can claim when purchasing an electric car. It prohibits the subsidy from being used to buy vehicles with battery components from China. Of the 72 electric vehicle models that are currently eligible for the rebate, 70% of them no longer would be under the legislation. So a big chunk of the EV tax credit in the bill is reliant on a car supply chain that currently doesn't exist. The Journal notes that the big winners of the legislation will be Tesla and GM. Even with the rebates, the purchase of an electric car is often out of the price range of most working class folks, and the rebate is means tested, so it won't apply to rich people who had planned to purchase the car. So again, the carbon reduction goals of the legislation depend on how effective the market tweaks are at changing consumer behavior. And I'm not a guy that has much faith in so-called market-based solutions. Of course, one huge way to lower demand for fossil fuels would be investing in clean mass transit, but there are no such substantial investments in this bill. It enshrines a car-based future of transportation. There are also very few provisions in the bill to curb emissions by limiting the supply side of fossil fuel production, which is absolutely necessary to prevent runaway global warming. The UN has warned that there cannot be any more new fossil fuel extraction projects if governments are going to avoid climate catastrophe. Yet the bill locks in fossil fuel production for another decade by mandating that new renewable development on federal lands must also be accompanied by fossil fuel extraction. It opens up wide swaths of the Gulf of Mexico to drilling. It provides subsidies to dirty coal plants that would otherwise close down. And the estimates of carbon reduction in the Inflation Reduction Act take a hit as soon as you factor in a wave of new dirty fossil fuel infrastructure, like pipelines in West Virginia and Alaska, that will be fast-tracked under an agreement made with Senator Joe Manchin in order to secure his support for the bill. The West Virginia pipeline alone is estimated to produce emissions on the scale of 19 million cars and more than 20 coal-fired plants. So, is this really the best that the United States Congress and White House, under the control of Democrats, can do to save the planet? Maybe so. But saying this legislation is historic is meaningless in a country that doesn't have a history of making substantial climate change investments. And the fact that climate change legislation has to now be written by one of the most corrupt senators in DC, literal coal baron, and that it has to lock in fossil fuel extraction for decades and be sold as a means to actually reduce inflation and trim the deficit, these are all signs of a dysfunctional Congress, not an historic breakthrough. Hey, thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our new videos. Also, if you want to see Means Morning News in its complete form, not just the clips we post here, head on over to Means TV and get access to all our new episodes and our entire backlog, plus tons of other great movies and original TV shows.